Hi, everybody. Welcome to our last, fifth, and final conversation of Unit 3. We're talking about regional development banks today, which play an interesting role in finance, trade, and development policy. They are part of, though, of a larger global whole, and I need to start there in this conversation. We have a class in international studies called IS 323, International Monetary and Trade Organizations. That's a good one to really dive in deep and understand how all of this stuff fits together. We're just really skimming the surface today about the policies and practices and why they exist here in the international system. So we've got something called the International Monetary Fund, another thing called the World Bank, something called the World Trade Organization, and then on top, underpinning all of those, or outside in a bit, all of those are the regional development banks in Africa, in the Americas, in Europe, and in Asia. So to understand the role of the regional development banks, we need to go through those other things first. This can be confusing to people, and I understand. I'll try and make it as simple as I can, and I'll urge you to focus on the patterns that I'm discussing, not the specifics. And if you have a question about the patterns, shoot me an email because it's important to come away from a class on the United Nations with some exposure to these, even if you don't understand everything about them. You can say, yeah, I heard of those. I know what they're trying to do there. So, like with the organization of the rest of the United Nations and the UN system, the planning for the post-war economic system began during the war, even actually before the U.S. came into the war, when Churchill and Roosevelt first met in 1941 above aboard a destroyer in the Atlantic Ocean. Roosevelt was already talking about what might need to develop to try and ensure peace, a linked peace. And this concept, I'm going to let you read this instead of reading it to you, expressed by Cordell Hull, who was the U.S. Secretary of State through the war years, was a commonly held belief coming out of the war. It's one of the reasons why we have a European Union today, is they were trying to integrate their economies to try and bring up those who were who had the least opportunities and make it so that they were least likely to go to war, in part because they were doing better themselves, and also in part because you'd linked your economies together in a way that made it detrimental for you to go to war against one another. But in the post-war system, there was going to be a desire to level the playing field somewhat. And as many problems as we still have in global economics, it's a different structure than existed before the war. Before the war, there were certainly um, stringent attempts by the most powerful states to always dominate the other states. There was no surrendering of your sovereign right to dominate. If that meant that you, for example, destroyed a local market in order to dominate that market, and that maybe what you did is you took your agricultural surplus one year and you knew that there was a wheat growing area that was in a weaker state, and if you dumped your extra wheat there, you'd be able to sell it the next year because the local wheat growers would not have any ability to weather the dumping of your stuff onto their economy. That was considered a right. You also had formal occupation of custom houses. If you had a dispute of trade policy, if you were mad at what one country seemed to do to one of your companies, if you were upset about how much money they owed, then could actually invade a larger country, could actually invade and occupy the customs houses and collect duties until such time as they felt that recompense had been made, and then only then would they leave. This kind of thing tends not to happen after the war. There are some notable exceptions that some of you have had other kinds of courses might say, hey, what about United Fruit, Guatemala and other places? What about interference about oil rights in the 50s? Yes, those continue to exist on a less common basis, and one that becomes increasingly less accepted over time. So those are exceptions. Happy to talk about them. We're going to focus on the overarching pattern here. So I don't want to pretend that it all is well and everyone's just sharing happiness and joy afterwards and interested in the other guy, but it's a different commitment that does limit the big powers to some extent. That said, the system that comes out of Bretton Woods is a place in New Hampshire where 44 countries or so got together to talk about what the economic, monetary, trade systems, banking system finance system should look like after the war and how they could integrate to better things. Again, these are the 44 who are going to put money in 1944, 45. These are folks who are end up going to have a bigger say in how these play out. That means that as we go forward, even though in the first unit, we looked at the changing expectation of sovereignty and benefits over time, where a lot of the states who initially joined have less ability to get what they want done in a place like the General Assembly or the Economic and Social Council because the new states come to dominate them. That is not the case in the IMF and the World Bank, where you basically, instead of having a one country, one vote approach, you have shares in the fund or shares in the bank. And the more shares you have in the fund or the bank, the bigger portion of the say you have in how the bank or the fund spends its money or what the policies will be, which means it's the richer states that get on the ground first that have the biggest say. And that means that they get to institute their policies in the IMF and the World Bank. Yes, there is an attempt to do this. All this cool stuff that Cordell Hull expressed, there is an attempt. But there will be policies, ideas, and approaches that are held that still will shape the way those other countries must develop if they want the money from the fund or the bank. So here's the first two. The IMF is formed in 45, 46. It's a fund that's going to help with macroeconomic policies. In other words, they're going to help with finance systems, monetary systems. They're going to help give money to stabilize economies. And it comes with strings attached. They will say to countries, we think you need to change this part of your budget. You must reform the way you organize your central bank. You must do these things if you want the money. So the criticism comes particularly in places where it's costly for the states to implement those ideas from the IMF. Criticism comes where they actually ask for structural adjustments that damage the local economy, who can come out worse than when they started. There's a notable case from Jamaica in the early 1990s where they really screwed up the local Jamaican economy in ways in which the ideas expressed by Cordell Hull were supposed to avoid. The IMF then reformed itself to try not to make those mistakes, but still makes lots of others because of the way it's structured and who has a say in it. Similar to that is the World Bank, which focuses, so initially its name was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So the reconstruction was maybe self-explanatory in the post-war era. There was destruction on a massive scale throughout Europe, and so you needed to have a reconstruction, and that was one of the bank's jobs. They're to fund largely infrastructure projects or processes. So they're going to do big things like rebuild swaths of a city. They're going to build dams. They're going to build electric grids. They're going to build port facilities, airports, stuff like that. They too, though, have a strings attached sort of thing. They want to see certain things in the project, and they will pay more attention to what a country as a whole wants and not what individuals in the country want. So if China wants money from the World Bank and to build a dam, say, and they have to displace a bunch of people, the World Bank doesn't necessarily listen to what the people who are going to be displaced have to say, but what China wants. So it can be seen as an onerous system. The World Bank has since emerged or grown to different parts of it. So there are 5 main offices. You can read that here. You can pause it. You can look up online what these different things do. They all sort of develop from 45 to the late 60s, I believe. The last one of these came in with different branches, but the World Bank sort of operates in that same sort of management system. The shares in the bank determine how much you get. And so I want to skip past World Trade real fast and go to the African Development Bank. And then we'll go back. African Development Bank operates the same way. It operates with the largest share going to of the say going to the country or countries that have the largest number of shares in the bank, and you get a share based on how much money you have, percentage of money you have invested. But in this case, they set up a structure that prevents the non-local actors, the non-regional actors, from having a majority of the say. Okay, so like in the African Development Bank, somewhere around 60% of the money is from African states. Now, the largest single contributor outside it is the United Kingdom. They contribute lots of money to the African Development Bank, but the management structure of the bank prohibits the UK from having the largest share of the say in what goes on. In fact, it's Nigeria that has regionally the biggest share of the vote, but collectively they hold more money. more shares. So that's going to be something they attempt to correct, that the World Bank has. They just don't have as much money as this system does, so they can't fund the same size projects or have the same sort of impact scale-wise. Scope-wise, sure, you can have, for example, a microcredit program that funds individual families that comes from a local actor or a group of us even pooling our money. We could call it a bank, we could call it a fund, we could call it whatever we wanted. We can have lots of, the scope of our impact can matter to individual families across the board, but if they need to build a rail system, we just aren't going to cut it. You need to go to a different level, right? So how much infrastructure you need, how much development you need will determine in part what bank you go to. So another piece of the system, and operating directly off that idea that Cordell Hull expressed, was something called the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, or the GATT. You had several rounds of these that lasted, some of them several years, where they were trying to reduce tariffs to ease trade. And so different kinds of tariffs were targeted in different rounds. So there were, I think, 7 or 8 rounds from 1949 to 94, and there's currently a new round in play, GATT round. It's called the Doha round that started in 2001 that's working on tariffs. But in the mid-90s, you also had the formation of something called the World Trade Organization to formalize these. So the GATT is a sort of like a series of temporary treaties that's looking to facilitate trade between states. But the ongoing treaty-bound system that will be a permanent forum is the World Trade Organization. And there are rights and responsibilities for both developed and developing states, all of whom have to give something up to benefit in the system. So smaller states sometimes complain. Larger states complain all the time that they're hamstrung. That might be an indication that there's something going on that benefits all in some situations, even if it doesn't benefit all in all situations. So the WTO exists currently. So it's a little bit different than the banks. So the AFDB, for example, in its prioritization of issues, in 2015 issued their High Five plan, which you can see here expressed on the right. So these are the 5 things that they're going to try. And so when they're going to say feed Africa, industrialize Africa, these are macroeconomic, these are big ideas, big plans to improve the food delivery system, not necessarily to provide food to hungry individuals. That'll be left to other UN and partner agencies like the World Food Program. So this will be their job and what they've set as priorities, and they'll fund it based on input from people who have shares of the bank who reside primarily in Africa. So similar to the AFDB, there are these other regional development banks. So the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which retains its original name from the post-war. So all of these are structured like the African Development Bank, where you do have other players who are putting in money. So the United States, the UK, France, Russia, others who have money to put into the bank, but they do not end up with the lion's share of the decision making. They do end up with the lion's share of the decision making way back up here in the World Bank and on the World Bank system, in the IMF and in its system, but not in the regional development banks. Again, scope and scale matters, and what you're trying to accomplish in those regional development banks will impact whether you have to take a program and go through them, to go through the World Bank or the IMF, or to partner between the two. So as we wrap up the formal part, almost of the whole class, because Unit 4 only has a very brief lecture and reading component as you dive into the country you've chosen. And as you begin to look at a region, you're going to have to look at its regional development bank to see what it's up to, and look at the funding mechanisms that come from other places in the region. I'll have you go to the IMF and look at the programs that are in your region, what kinds and types are ongoing. I'll have you go to the World Bank and see what's going on. I'll have you go to the WTO and see if there's any disputes that are current at the World Bank. And then go to the Regional Development Bank and see what its priorities are. So I guess I give you a little bit of an advantage if you choose Africa as your region, because you already know what the High Five is, and you can draw that in your notes and turn it in to me. It'll be great. But the Regional Development Banks supplement and or act as a counterbalance. So to try and make sure that they have their regional voice heard most strongly compared to the big international trade, monetary, and financial organizations.